We last spoke to Adam Shoalts in April when he talked about his fascinating latest book, Whisper on the Night Wind. Not surprisingly, since then, actually only 6 days after we spoke, the intrepid explorer set out on an adventurous solo trek from Lake Erie to the Arctic, following the migratory path of birds during their migration season. I have to ask you, Adam, what was more dangerous, that trip or crossing the QEW overpass to get to our studio here today?
Well, that's a good question. I wouldn't want to hazard a guess. You'd have to really crunch the numbers on that. For a journey that was 3,400 kilometers all the way to the Arctic, I will say that maybe the most hazardous part was on the Great Lakes with the commercial shipping. I didn't really anticipate beforehand just how busy the freighter traffic is coming out of Hamilton Harbor and Montreal and those busy ports. And that actually made me more nervous than anything like polar bears in the north. Like, those ships are massive and they move a lot faster than you would expect in a canoe.
You were on a 15-foot canoe.
I was on a 15-foot canoe, and even if you paddle as hard as you can, it's nothing compared to how fast one of those ships can go. Now, I try to stay out of their shipping lanes as much as possible, but there were places like Montreal where I had no choice. I had to cross right the center of the river to get from one side to the other. There was no way to avoid it. And I would think, well, how often can one of those freighters come by? Because I mean, if it's a smaller boat, they'll just see you and avoid you. But those ships are so massive, they have a blind spot.
And they call it Highway H2O, yeah. Right? So it is busy.
Yeah, and a little ship is like, it might as well be a leaf in the water for all they can see down below. So I would have to just wait until I could see a break between them and paddle as fast as I could. So yeah, that was kind of an unexpected hazard on the journey.
Take me along that trip. You went up the St. Lawrence?
Down the St. Lawrence.
Down the St. Lawrence.
Well, I started right on Lake Erie at Long Point in Norfolk County.
Right.
Which is sort of ground zero for the bird migration. And I paddled along the north shore of Lake Erie all the way past Port Dover, Port Maitland, Wainfleet, Port Colborne to Fort Erie. And then I went under the Peace Bridge in my canoe, zoomed along the Niagara River, past Navy Island. I actually camped on Navy Island one night. And then I paddled as close to the brink of the Horseshoe Falls as I dared, just above the hydro intake, edging along the shoreline. And then when it was not safer to go any further, I got out. And I had a little set of wheels that I had bought beforehand. I strapped the canoe onto the wheels, threw all my gear in it, and I just literally wheeled it along the pathway there, 13 kilometers past the brink of the falls, and then down past the Whirlpool Rapids, all the way down to Queenston, where I put the boat back in the Niagara River. And then it was a straight shot down the rest of the river all the way out to Niagara on the Lake. And then to get across Lake Ontario, I couldn't cut across the center in my little tiny canoe, especially with the huge waves. So I followed the shoreline, past St. Catharines, Grimsby, all the way out to Hamilton, and then along the north shore past Toronto. It was interesting trying to find a camping site there for my tent. All the way to Kingston, and then down the St. Lawrence, through the Thousand Islands, past Montreal, Trois-Rivières, past Quebec City, all the way out to where it gets salty and there's tides. And then at that point, I turned north and worked my way almost 1,000 kilometers north up to Labrador. And then it was across Labrador, and then finally straight shot down to the Torngat Mountains, which is on the Arctic coast. Just sort of tucked away right up at the northeast corner of Canada beyond the tree line. And that was my end point, right out on the coast of Ungava Bay there. So from one coast to the other coast.
What was the temperature swing from your time here in Niagara up to the Arctic?
So right now we're going through this massive heat wave, but back in April, the temperature was unseasonably cold. And I remember on like day 4, I was getting around the break wall at Port Colborne and there were snow squalls. It was like a snowstorm that hit Port Colborne and Fort Erie while I was paddling. So the spring was actually unusually cold, and I remember like going towards the Gulf of St. Lawrence, I kept thinking the temperature's gonna warm up, I can start taking layers off, but the warm weather never really arrived. And right up until the end of my journey almost, the temperature was consistently down around 9 or 10 degrees. And because I kept going further north, it was like I never really reached the warm weather. So at the end of my journey, even though it's July, there was still snow along the river, snow and ice and things. So I was usually wearing a jacket and sometimes a wool toque every day. So it was quite the shock to come back to 30-degree temperatures here.
How do you come back? You don't canoe back.
No,
so
I thought about that, to do the journey all the way back, but then it would be about 6 or 7 months. And my wife said, I don't know if that's a good idea.
You have a new baby.
Yes, I do. So I wanted to get home as quick as I could. And fortunately, 3 months there, only 5 days back. I got on a little tiny plane, an Otter, and then flew to another community, sort of the central hub in the eastern Arctic. And then from there, you can get a flight down to Montreal, and then make my way back to Ontario from there. So
you take lots of photos along the way. You also keep a journal, and we know that that's one of the things that you do on your trips, because this will hopefully make it into a book soon.
Yeah, I hope so as well. I wrote a journal every day, and one thing I was quite different from any journey I've ever done before is because I was traveling through southern Canada and pretty big cities at that time like Toronto and Montreal, I met quite a few people along the way. I mean, a few years ago when I did the journey alone across the Arctic, I didn't see anyone for months at a time. So in my journal, I tried to write down everyone's names I met with, because all kinds of people I crossed paths with, literally everyone I met was incredibly kind to me. And some of them, when they heard that I was canoeing to the Arctic, after they got over the part of thinking I was insane, they'd be like, well, wait right here. I'm going to go to Tim Hortons. I'm going to buy you a coffee or a donut, right? Yeah. So, I mean, I was passing through Quebec, and I remember it was stormy weather, and I was just sheltering under an oak tree in this terrible rainstorm, very cold, and there was an old woman who lived nearby, and she saw me, and she brought me French onion soup. And when you're hungry and cold and wet, that kind of a nice gesture means everything in the world. So I kept a record of all that in my journal, and I hope at one point to be able to turn it into a book.
To me, this is like an athletic endeavor.
Yeah, very much.
Test your endurance.
Exactly. You have to think about calories. How much are you eating? How often do you eat? How's your shoulder doing? You're paddling long hours. I mean, it really is like a marathon race, right? The only way to do it is to put in very long days, because at the end of the day, you can be the fastest canoeist in the world, but it's a canoe. You can't go much more than 7 or 8 kilometers an hour. So it's all about putting in 12, 13-hour days. Sometimes if the weather was good and there was no wind, I could paddle up to 15, 16 hours. And it was the darkness that would make me stop. So I would get a little bit worried because there are hazards along the lakes. Right. I remember I was paddling late along the Lake Erie shore, and there was an old concrete dock that was sort of just below where the waves were lapping. And I didn't really expect a concrete dock to be jutting way out in the lake there, and it was dark and I didn't see it. And at the last moment, I did a quick move with my paddle just to avoid that. But I was like, okay, I think I better stop paddling in the dark, because my luck is going to run out, and sooner or later I'm going to hit something that I can't even see in the water down below here. But when the weather was calm, it was hard to resist the temptation to paddle, because the wind was such a critical factor. There were some days on Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, where the waves were just too large and they would swamp my canoe if I dared go out in them. I was actually trapped just underneath the Burlington Skyway for a day, because the waves there coming across the lake and hitting the end of the lake were just far too big to paddle in. So I ended up making a camp underneath the Burlington Skyway. Fortunately, there's a little patch of forest there. And I said, okay, this is going to be home for the night. And when the weather dies down, bright and early in the morning, I'll break camp and get back on the water. So,
well, this is going to make a great book. What's your next adventure?
I haven't even really unpacked from this one yet. So,
but I know you've got to have your mind set on something.
I do. When I had free time on my journey, I was writing out ideas for new expeditions and adventures, and I filled out the rest of the decade, the 2020s, with plans. So I have a lot of different ideas in the works. Some a little bit different, more history, archaeology based. There are some really fascinating old fur trade posts and ghost towns and things I want to go search for, artifacts from the past. But a little bit of everything. I mean, there's only one life to live and so many adventures, I could never possibly do them all. So the list is long, and I'll get to it as soon as I can.
Adam, we can't wait to find out what your next adventure will be. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.